Nobody hit you. Nobody abandoned you. Nobody did anything obviously wrong. And yet something happened to you. Something quiet. Something chronic. Something that shaped every relationship you've had, every time you've asked for help or refused to, and every moment you've felt like your pain didn't count. If you were born between 1965 and 1980, there's a name for what you carry. And most of you have never heard it. Trauma has a branding problem. When most people hear the word, they picture something dramatic. An accident. Abuse. A loss so visible that everyone around you stops to acknowledge it. But psychology has known for decades that the most pervasive form of trauma isn't loud. It's quiet. It's the thing that didn't happen when it should have. The comfort that wasn't there. The parent who was physically present but emotionally unreachable. The childhood that required you to be more competent than any child should have to be. Researchers call this developmental trauma, or more specifically, complex developmental trauma. And Generation X, more than any other living generation, was systematically exposed to the conditions that create it. Not because their parents were monsters, not because the world was especially cruel, but because an entire culture decided, simultaneously, that children were more resilient than they actually are, and left an entire generation to prove it. Let's start with what developmental trauma actually is, because this is where most people get confused. Traditional trauma models focus on specific events. Something happened. It was overwhelming. The nervous system couldn't process it. That framework works for acute trauma, the kind with a clear before and after. But developmental trauma is different. It's not about a single event. It's about a pattern. A pattern of emotional unavailability. A pattern of unmet attachment needs. A pattern of being required, repeatedly, to regulate your own nervous system before your nervous system was built to do that. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, one of the world's leading trauma researchers, describes it this way. The nervous system doesn't develop in isolation. It develops in relationship. When a child has consistent access to a regulated, responsive caregiver, their own nervous system learns to regulate. When that access is inconsistent or absent, the nervous system learns something different. It learns to go it alone. It learns to suppress need. It learns that vulnerability is dangerous and self-sufficiency is survival. For Generation X, this wasn't an individual experience. It was a collective one. 40% of Gen X children grew up in single-parent households. Divorce rates doubled between 1960 and 1980. The Latchkey kid wasn't an exception. It was a demographic reality. Millions of children came home to empty houses, managed their own afternoons, cooked their own dinners, and learned that needing someone meant being disappointed. That lesson wasn't just behavioral. It was neurological. It got wired in. Here's what that wiring looks like in adulthood. And see how many of these feel familiar. You struggle to ask for help, not because you don't need it, but because something inside you insists you should be able to handle it yourself. You feel vaguely guilty when you're struggling, as if struggle itself is a personal failure. You have a high tolerance for stress. Maybe too high. You don't notice how depleted you are until you're completely empty. In relationships, you want closeness, but intimacy makes you uncomfortable. When someone gets too close, something in you pulls back. You're deeply competent. Impressively so. And yet, no level of external achievement fully quiets the low hum of inadequacy running underneath it. If you recognize yourself in any of that, I want to be clear about something. Those are not personality traits. Those are adaptations. Every single one of them was a solution once. When you were 8 years old, and there was no adult available to help you regulate a scary feeling, you found a way to do it yourself. When you were 12, and the environment was unpredictable, you became hypervigilant, always scanning, always preparing, because that kept you safe. When you were a teenager and emotional expression felt risky, you learned to contain it. These were intelligent responses to a difficult environment. The problem is that intelligent responses from childhood become automatic programs in adulthood. And automatic programs don't check whether the original conditions still apply. There's a concept in trauma psychology called the window of tolerance. It describes the optimal zone of nervous system activation, not too high, not too low, where a person can think clearly, feel fully, and respond rather than react. When development goes well, that window is wide. Life can throw difficult things, and the nervous system handles them with some degree of flexibility. When development involves chronic unmet attachment needs, the way it did for millions of Gen X children, that window narrows. The nervous system either spikes into hyperarousal, anxiety, hypervigilance, control, or collapses into hypoarousal, numbness, disconnection, going through the motions. What it struggles to find is the middle. And here's what makes this particularly invisible for Gen X specifically. The culture around them reinforced the adaptation as a virtue. You were called resilient. You were praised for being independent. You were told you weren't like those other kids who couldn't handle things. So the very coping mechanisms that were symptoms of developmental injury got reframed as character strengths. And when something is labeled a strength, you don't seek help for it. You double down on it. You make it your identity. You build your entire adult life on top of it. Until one day, in a relationship, in a burnout, in a therapist's office, in a quiet moment at 3 a.m., something cracks. And you realize the foundation wasn't strength. It was scar tissue. The hardest part of invisible trauma isn't the wound itself. It's the absence of witness. When something obviously terrible happens to a child, the people around them mobilize. They're asked how they're doing. Their pain is acknowledged. The event gets named. But chronic developmental trauma doesn't work that way. Nobody sat down with the 8-year-old Gen X child coming home to an empty house and said, "This is hard. What you're carrying is real. You shouldn't have to do this alone." Nobody named it. Nobody witnessed it. And when pain goes unwitnessed long enough, something very specific happens inside the person who carries it. They stop witnessing themselves. They stop being able to say, "This hurt. This was too much. This cost me something." Because for so long, no one around them reflected that back. So they stopped reflecting it to themselves. Research on emotional neglect, the systematic absence of emotional attunement in childhood, shows consistent outcomes. Adults who experienced it have difficulty identifying their own emotional states. They have lower interoceptive awareness, meaning they're less able to read their own internal signals. They often describe a persistent sense that something is wrong but an inability to name what. Sound familiar? This is what invisible trauma does. It doesn't leave visible marks. It leaves a gap where the witness was supposed to be. And in that gap lives a very particular kind of loneliness. The loneliness of a person who has been through a great deal and never had it acknowledged. Not even by themselves. So what does healing look like for something this quiet? It starts with the hardest thing Gen X was never taught to do. Naming it. Not performing it. Not dramatizing it. Not demanding that others acknowledge it. Just quietly, privately, accurately naming what happened. The childhood was genuinely hard. The independence wasn't just capability, it was necessity. The self-sufficiency wasn't just character, it was survival. And somewhere underneath all of that competence, there was a child who needed more than they got. That is not weakness to admit. That is not complaining. That is not canceling your parents. That is just accurate. Trauma researcher Dr. Peter Levine says that healing doesn't require reliving the past. It requires completing the response the nervous system never got to finish. For Gen X, that often looks less like dramatic breakthrough and more like small, consistent acts of self-witnessing. Noticing when you're depleted and not pushing through anyway. Letting someone help you and staying present through the discomfort of being helped. Saying, "I'm struggling," to someone who is safe, and not immediately following it with, "But I'm fine." These aren't small things. For a nervous system wired to go it alone, these are enormous things. And they compound. Every time you witness yourself, you rebuild something that was missing in the original architecture. If this video named something you've been carrying without a name, share it. Not because your story needs to be public, but because someone you know is carrying the same thing in silence. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let them know they're not the only one. Next video, we go into Gen Z, the most anxious generation science has ever studied, and why their anxiety isn't weakness, it's a rational response to an irrational world. See you there.